Picture this. It's November of 1941, in a hotel room on Coney Island, and there are 6 cops standing guard, 2 inside the room, 4 outside the door, watching over a man the newspapers have started calling Kid Twist. He isn't a boss. He isn't even, by the standards of his world, a particularly important man. But he knows things. He knows names, dates, who pulled which trigger on which corner in Brooklyn on which night going back a decade. He has already sent men to the electric chair with nothing but his memory and his testimony. And somewhere between midnight and sunrise, with 6 armed men supposedly watching him, he goes out a 6th-floor window and lands on a rooftop extension below, dead before anyone even notices he's gone. The official story is that he tried to escape using bed sheets tied together. The sheets were found neatly folded in the room. He didn't need to escape, he was free to leave whenever he wanted, a protected witness under police guard, not a prisoner. So why would a man who had already talked, who had already made himself the most hated informer in the history of organized crime, climb out a window in the middle of the night and fall to his death, and why would nobody watching him admit to seeing a single moment of it happen? That's where we're going today. Stick with me. Before we go down into the streets of Brownsville and into the room at the Half Moon Hotel, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now wherever you are. I read every one of them, and it genuinely helps this channel when you take 5 seconds to say hello. Now, pull up a chair, dim the lights if you can, and let's step into the shadows. Long before there was a man called Kid Twist, before there was a name that made hardened criminals go pale, before there was a room at the Half Moon Hotel and a window and a rooftop and a mystery that has outlived every person who could have solved it, there was just a boy. A small, weary, restless boy walking the cracked pavement of Brownsville, Brooklyn, in the years right around the First World War, when that neighborhood was less a place you lived and more a place you survived. Abe Reles was born there in 1906, the son of Austrian Jewish immigrants who had crossed an ocean carrying the same dream that so many families carried in those years, that America, even in its ugliest, most overcrowded corners, would be kinder to their children than the old country had been to them. Brownsville in that era was a tenement world, block after block of narrow buildings pressed together with barely enough light between them, pushcarts crowding the curbs, the air thick with the smell of the markets, of coal smoke, of too many people living too close together with too little money and too little room to breathe. It was a neighborhood of workers, garment cutters, pushcart peddlers, small shopkeepers, but it was also, and this mattered more than anything for the boy who would grow up there, a neighborhood that bred a particular kind of hardness in its children. You did not survive Brownsville by being soft. You survived it by being quick, by being tough, by knowing which alleys to avoid after dark and which ones you could claim as your own if you were willing to fight for them. By the time he was still a child in years but already something else in temperament, Reles had drifted away from whatever softness his parents might have hoped to give him. School held nothing for him. The classroom, with its rules and its patience and its promise of a distant reward for years of quiet obedience, was a poor match for a boy whose intelligence was real but whose instincts ran entirely toward the immediate, the physical, the street. He was small, he would remain a small man his whole life, wiry rather than powerful, the kind of build that in another world might have made him a target rather than a threat. But there was something in him from very early on, something that the other boys in the neighborhood picked up on before any adult did, a willingness to go further than the others would go, to escalate past the point where most children's nerve would break. Where other boys in a street fight would trade blows until someone backed down, Reles was the kind of boy who kept coming, who did not seem to register the normal signals that told a person the fight was over. That quality, the refusal to stop, the absence of whatever internal break most people carry that tells them enough is enough, would define nearly everything that happened to him for the rest of his life, and it would define how he died as well. He fell in, as so many boys in that world did, with the loose collections of street kids who ran in packs through Brownsville streets, stealing what they could, fighting over territory that had no value except that it was theirs, learning the informal economy of the neighborhood the way other children learned arithmetic. And it was in this world, somewhere in his early teenage years, that he crossed paths with the boy who would become the other half of his story for the rest of his life, a slightly younger, similarly hard-edged kid named Martin Goldstein, whom everyone would eventually come to know by the name that fit him with an almost cruel precision, Bugsy. The two of them found in each other something like a matched set, two boys cut from the same cloth of poverty and violence and ambition, and where Reles supplied a certain cold calculation, a willingness to think 2 and 3 moves ahead the way a chess player thinks, Goldstein supplied a raw, almost gleeful appetite for brutality that even in a neighborhood full of hard boys stood out as something different, something the other kids gave a wide berth to. Together, Reles and Goldstein began to build something. It started small, the way these things always start small: petty theft, small extortions, muscle work for older men in the neighborhood who needed something done and were willing to pay boys who didn't ask questions. But Brownsville in the 1920s was not a place where small stayed small for long, not if you had ambition, and Reles had ambition in a quantity that would eventually become its own kind of curse. The 1920s were, of course, the era of Prohibition, and Prohibition had done something extraordinary to the criminal landscape of every major American city, but perhaps nowhere more so than in New York. It had taken what had been, in the prior decades, a patchwork of neighborhood gangs squabbling over gambling and small-time rackets, and it had handed all of them, all at once, access to an enormously profitable illegal industry, the production, transport, and sale of liquor to a public that had never stopped wanting it. Bootlegging did not just make individual criminals rich. It restructured the entire underworld, forcing loose neighborhood gangs to organize, to build supply chains, to negotiate territory with rivals, to develop the kind of business discipline that had never been necessary when the stakes were a few stolen goods and a corner crap game. Brownsville had its own bootlegging operations, and a teenage Reles, sharp enough to see where the money was moving and vicious enough to make himself useful to the men who controlled it, began working his way into that world. He and Goldstein started running with, and eventually working for, the local bootlegging operations that supplied the neighborhood speakeasies, and it was through this work, hauling liquor, guarding shipments, occasionally beating or worse the men who tried to hijack a shipment or muscle in on territory, that Reles first came into contact with the men who ran the more serious rackets in Brownsville, men who were themselves connected upward into the larger criminal network spreading across Brooklyn and Manhattan. It's worth pausing here, before the story accelerates, to understand something about the particular flavor of the Brownsville underworld that Reles was climbing into, because it explains so much of what came later. Brownsville's criminal element in this period was overwhelmingly Jewish, a product of the neighborhood's demographics, and it existed somewhat apart from, though increasingly connected to, the Italian and Sicilian organized crime networks that dominated the popular imagination and, in truth, dominated much of the city's rackets as well. This was an era when American organized crime was still sorting out its own internal architecture, still working out whether ethnic gangs would remain separate, competing fiefdoms, or whether they would find ways to cooperate, to divide territory and profit along business lines rather than tribal ones. The men who would eventually engineer that cooperation, men like Charles, Lucky, Luciano and Meyer Lansky, understood something that a lot of old-school gang leaders never grasped, that violence between rival gangs was bad for business, that a criminal enterprise run with the discipline of a corporation would always out-earn one run on pride and vendetta, and that if you wanted a genuinely national criminal syndicate, you needed a way to resolve disputes between different gangs and different cities without every disagreement turning into a shooting war that drew the attention of newspapers and prosecutors. Reles did not create this system, but he would become, in time, one of its most efficient instruments, and understanding that he was not simply a wild street thug but eventually a trusted, valued operator within a genuinely organized and disciplined criminal structure, is essential to understanding why the men above him eventually trusted him with the kind of information that would prove so devastating once he decided to give it away. Through the back half of the 1920s, Reles and Goldstein continued to build their standing in Brownsville, and they were joined by other young men who would remain fixtures in Reles' story for the rest of his life, men like Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, a chillingly meticulous killer whose own later reputation for calm, almost professional murder would rival Reles' own, and Harry Mayone, known as Happy, with the kind of bitter neighborhood irony that gave so many of these men their nicknames, since there was nothing remotely happy about him. This was the core, slowly assembling itself out of shared streets and shared violence and shared ambition, of what would eventually become one of the most notorious and effective killing organizations in American criminal history. But that was still ahead of them. In these years, they were simply a Brownsville crew, tough, feared locally, useful to the older and more established racketeers who controlled the neighborhood's gambling and loan sharking and protection rackets, men who needed enforcers and were willing to let ambitious young killers rise through the ranks as long as they proved themselves reliable, discreet, and effective. And Reles proved himself, again and again, in the years that followed. He was arrested, repeatedly. Over the course of his life he would be arrested dozens of times, on charges ranging from disorderly conduct to assault to homicide, but arrests in this world, in this era, in this particular corner of Brooklyn where witnesses had a way of forgetting what they'd seen and evidence had a way of disappearing, rarely translated into convictions that stuck. He built a reputation not just for violence but for a particular kind of cold, businesslike violence, the kind that unsettled even other criminals, because there was no heat in it, no rage, nothing personal, it was simply what needed to happen, calculated and carried out with the same emotional temperature you might bring to balancing a ledger. That quality, more than raw physical toughness, is what began to draw the attention of the men running the larger rackets in Brooklyn, men who were themselves increasingly connected to the citywide and eventually nationwide criminal combination that was assembling itself under Luciano and Lansky and their associates in the early 1930s. A killer who killed out of anger was a liability. Angry men made mistakes, angry men talked, angry men drew attention. A killer who killed the way Reles killed, without visible emotion, purely as an assignment to be completed and then set aside, was an asset of tremendous and rare value. By the early 1930s, the loose Brownsville crew that had formed around Reles and Goldstein and Strauss and Mahon had begun to formalize into something more structured, something that would eventually be given a name by the press that would outlive every man in it and become one of the most infamous labels in the history of American crime, Murder, Incorporated. The organization, as it eventually came to be understood by investigators and later by the public, functioned essentially as a contract killing service for the broader National Crime Syndicate, a Brooklyn-based unit of killers who could be called upon by organized crime figures anywhere in the country to carry out executions on people the syndicate had determined needed to disappear. Informants, rival racketeers, men who had crossed the wrong people or skimmed from the wrong operation or simply become inconvenient to someone with the authority to order them removed. It operated with a discipline and an almost bureaucratic efficiency that stood in sharp contrast to the popular image of gangland murder as chaotic and impulsive. Orders came down through a chain of authority. Killers were selected for specific jobs based on their particular skills and their unfamiliarity with the target, precisely so that no personal motive could ever be traced. Bodies were often made to disappear entirely rather than left as a message, because the syndicate's leadership had learned, in the bloody and undisciplined years of the late 1920s gang wars, that a body in the street generated headlines and heat and police pressure, while a body that was never found generated nothing but a quiet, permanent absence. Reles, by virtue of his intelligence, his local standing, and his sheer reliability as a killer who could be trusted to complete an assignment without complication, rose to become one of the operation's central figures, not the absolute top of the chain, which remained under the control of men like Lewis, Lepka, Buckleter and Albert Anastasia, syndicate leaders operating at a level far above street enforcers, but high enough within the Brooklyn structure that he had genuine authority, genuine knowledge of operations, and genuine access to the kind of information that, in the wrong hands, could unravel the entire enterprise. He was, by the accounts of men who worked with him and men who investigated him, whip-smart in a way that had nothing to do with formal education and everything to do with a kind of ruthless practical intelligence. He understood people, understood leverage, understood how to read a room and how to make himself indispensable to the men above him while keeping the men below him properly afraid. He earned money, real money, more than he had ever imagined as a boy running the cracked pavements of Brownsville, and with that money came the trappings that so many men in his position seemed to gravitate toward almost against their own better judgment: nicer clothes, a wife, a home that was a universe away from the tenement crowding of his childhood, a life that, from the outside, might have looked almost respectable if you didn't know what paid for it. But there is a particular tragedy, or perhaps irony is the better word, that runs through the story of nearly every man who rose within Murder, Incorporated, and Reles' story carries it as clearly as any of them. The very skills that made him valuable, his intelligence, his memory for detail, his understanding of exactly how the operation worked, who gave which orders, who carried out which killings, how the money moved and the bodies disappeared, were precisely the skills that would eventually make him the single most dangerous man alive to every one of his former associates, the moment his own loyalty broke. A stupid killer, a purely violent man with no real understanding of the larger structure he served, could never have brought down an organization. He simply wasn't positioned to know enough. But Reles knew everything. He had been present, in one capacity or another, for a staggering number of the organization's murders over the years. Historians and investigators would eventually credit information from him with implicating the perpetrators of somewhere in the range of 80 to 100 killings, an almost unbelievable number that speaks to just how central he had become to the machinery of Brooklyn's underworld violence. He carried, quite literally, inside his own head, the operational history of one of the most lethal criminal enterprises in American history. And for years, that made him one of the most powerful and feared men in his world. It would also, eventually, make him one of the most hunted, and finally, in a hotel room on Coney Island with police officers standing guard outside his door, one of the most mysterious deaths in the history of American crime. We're going to leave him here for now, a young man risen from Brownsville's tenements to a position of real power within the most efficient killing operation organized crime in America had ever produced, a man who believed, as so many men in his position believed, that the loyalty running upward through the chain of command was a two-way street, that the organization would protect the men who served it faithfully. That belief was about to be tested in ways Reles could not have imagined, by events that would begin to close in on him from multiple directions at once, a new district attorney with ambitions of his own, a series of arrests that would not simply go away the way they always had before, and a decision, made in the loneliness of a jail cell, that would change the entire course of his life and the lives of dozens of men who had once called him a brother in blood. There is a particular kind of confidence that settles over a man who has spent a decade and a half getting away with things. It isn't arrogance exactly, though from the outside it can look like arrogance. It's something closer to a learned expectation, built arrest by arrest, dismissal by dismissal, over so many years that it stops feeling like luck and starts feeling like a law of nature. By the mid-1930s, Abe Reles had that confidence in abundance. He had been arrested, by his own accounting and by the count of the detectives who'd hauled him in, more times than most career criminals manage in a lifetime, for disorderly conduct, for assault, for robbery, for homicide itself, more than once. And every single time, the case had come apart in his hands like wet paper. Witnesses developed sudden amnesia. Evidence went missing or was never quite strong enough. Juries, when it got that far, found reasons for doubt. Reles had learned, through repetition, that the machinery of justice in Brooklyn in that era was slow, distractible, and, when the right pressure was applied in the right places, remarkably forgetful. He had every reason, walking into the second half of the 1930s, to believe that whatever came next would go the same way everything else had gone. He was wrong, and the reason he was wrong had a name, and that name was Thomas E. Dewey, and later, more locally and more dangerously for Reles specifically, a relentless, obsessive Brooklyn district attorney named William O'Dwyer. To understand what changed, you have to understand what had stayed the same for so long, and why. Brooklyn's rackets, through the 20s and into the 30s, had operated inside a kind of ecosystem of mutual convenience. Local police in neighborhoods like Brownsville were not, as a rule, incorruptible men standing as a lone wall between the criminal underworld and the innocent public. Many of them were paid, quietly and routinely, to look in the other direction, to lose paperwork, to conveniently forget details when they took the stand. Local judges, local prosecutors, local politicians, the whole apparatus of law and order at the neighborhood level had, in greater or lesser degrees, been absorbed into the same economy that fed the bootleggers and the loan sharks and the killers, because that economy was simply too profitable and too well organized to resist, and because the men who ran it had gotten very, very good at making resistance expensive for anyone who tried it. Reles had grown up entirely inside that ecosystem. He had never really known a version of law enforcement that could not, eventually, be managed. What he had not accounted for, because it had never happened to him before, was a prosecutor who could not be managed, who did not want money and did not fear the consequences of making powerful enemies, and who had decided, with something close to a personal mission, that organized crime in New York was going to be dismantled on his watch or he was going to die trying. Thomas Dewey's rise as a racket-busting prosecutor in Manhattan through the mid-1930s had already sent tremors through the entire structure of organized crime in New York, culminating most famously in the prosecution and conviction of Lucky Luciano himself on prostitution-related charges in 1936, a case that stunned the underworld precisely because it demonstrated that even the most powerful, most insulated men at the very top of the syndicate were not, in fact, untouchable. Luciano's conviction sent him to prison for decades and sent a message down through every layer of the criminal hierarchy that the old rules, the rules that had let men like Reles walk free case after case after case, no longer applied with the same certainty they once had. It did not stop the rackets. It did not dismantle the syndicate. But it introduced something that had been almost entirely absent from the calculations of men like Reles for the whole of his adult life, fear that the law itself, applied by the right kind of prosecutor with the right kind of resources and the right kind of political will, might actually work. That fear crystallized, for Reles specifically, in Brooklyn, where a new district attorney named William O'Dwyer took office determined to do in Kings County what Dewey had done in Manhattan, to go after not just individual crimes but the entire structure that made those crimes possible, to build cases not around single incidents but around patterns, conspiracies, chains of command. O'Dwyer assembled a team of investigators and prosecutors specifically tasked with taking apart the Brooklyn rackets, and Brownsville, with its long, blood-soaked history of gang violence and its concentration of exactly the kind of career criminals O'Dwyer wanted to prosecute, became one of his primary targets. And here is where the story turns, where the machinery that had protected Reles for 15 years began, for the first time, to genuinely fail him. In late 1939 and into 1940, O'Dwyer's investigators began pulling in members of Reles' own circle on various charges, and among the men they picked up was a lower-level operative who, faced with the prospect of a long prison sentence and lacking Reles' particular brand of icy resolve, began talking. This was not, in itself, unprecedented. Men had talked before, informants had surfaced before, and in the past the organization had generally been able to handle it, through intimidation, through bribery, through the occasional necessary killing of the informant himself before he could testify. But O'Dwyer's operation was different in scale and in seriousness, and the information beginning to flow toward his office was starting to paint a picture, fragmentary at first, but growing more detailed, of an organized, disciplined killing apparatus operating out of Brownsville, one responsible for an almost incomprehensible number of murders stretching back years, murders that had never been solved. In some cases never even been recognized as murders at all, victims who had simply vanished. And been quietly written off by families and by police alike as men who had run off or disappeared into some other life. Reles, watching this unfold from his position of relative power within the organization, would have understood better than almost anyone what was actually at stake, because he understood, better than almost anyone, just how much any real investigation into Brownsville's rackets was eventually going to uncover. He was not a man positioned at the periphery of the killing operation. He was close to its center. If O'Dwyer's investigators kept pulling threads, kept flipping lower-level men one after another, the thread would eventually lead directly to him, and once it reached him, there would be no bribing it away and no witness conveniently forgetting what they'd seen, because O'Dwyer's people were building cases methodically, corroborating testimony, cross-referencing accounts in a way that Brooklyn's old, comfortable, corruptible system of justice had never bothered to do. In February of 1940, that fear became reality. Reles was arrested, along with several of his closest associates, on a murder charge connected to the killing of a small-time hoodlum, the kind of case that, in earlier years, might have simply evaporated the way so many cases against him had evaporated before. But this time was different, and Reles, sitting in a cell with the weight of everything he knew pressing down on him, and with the growing, unmistakable sense that this time the walls really were closing in for good, began to do something that must have felt, in the moment, almost unthinkable, given everything he had built his entire adult identity around. He began to calculate not how to beat the case, but how to survive what was coming after it. It's worth sitting with that moment for a while, because it is the true hinge point of Reles' entire story, the moment every single thing that happened afterward, the trials, the convictions of men who had once been his brothers in blood, the room at the Half Moon Hotel, the fall from the 6th-floor window, flows directly out of. What was he actually weighing, in that cell, in those weeks? On one side of the ledger, the code he had lived by since he was a teenage boy running Brownsville's cracked pavements, a code that placed loyalty and silence above almost everything else, a code whose violation was understood, by every single man in his world, to carry a single, absolute, non-negotiable penalty. Men who talked did not simply face social consequences. They died, and their deaths were made examples of, precisely so that the lesson would be absorbed by every other man who might ever be tempted to consider the same path. Reles himself had almost certainly participated in the killing of men suspected of exactly this kind of disloyalty. He knew, better than anyone, exactly what waited for an informant, because he had likely been the instrument of that fate for others. On the other side of the ledger sat something that, for a man like Reles, may have been even more unfamiliar and more frightening than the prospect of retaliation, the very real possibility of the electric chair. New York in this era executed people, and it executed them for exactly the kind of crimes O'Dwyer's investigators were now assembling evidence to charge Reles with. A murder conviction, corroborated the way O'Dwyer's team was building corroboration, was not a case Reles could count on beating the way he'd beaten every prior case in his life. He was, for what might have been the first time since he was a teenager, genuinely and rationally afraid, not of a rival gangster, not of a beating, not of a stretch in prison he could simply wait out, but of a specific, state-sanctioned death that no amount of intimidated witnesses or bribed cops could make disappear. And so, sometime in the months following his arrest, in conversations that would later become the stuff of underworld legend and law enforcement mythology alike, Abe Reles made the decision that would define the rest of his life and, in a very real sense, define the rest of his death. He decided to talk. Not in the halting, incomplete, easily contradicted way that lower-level operatives had talked before him, offering fragments in exchange for lighter treatment, but completely, exhaustively, with the same cold, methodical thoroughness he had once brought to organizing murders. He began providing O'Dwyer's investigators with names, dates, methods, motives, a systematic accounting of years of killings that no one outside the organization's innermost circle could possibly have reconstructed, because no one outside that innermost circle had actually been there for so much of it. He named the men who had given the orders. He named the men who had pulled the triggers or wielded the ice picks or tightened the ropes. He described, in the kind of granular, unshakable detail that only genuine first-hand knowledge could produce, how murder, incorporated actually functioned, how orders moved down the chain, how out-of-town killers were sometimes brought in specifically because they had no personal connection to a target and therefore no motive that could be traced, how bodies were disposed of, how the whole apparatus had been built and maintained. The effect, when this information began to be understood by O'Dwyer's office in its full scope, was seismic. This was not a single case being cracked. This was, potentially, the unraveling of one of the most lethal and long-running criminal conspiracies in American history, delivered not in pieces by a dozen frightened underlings but essentially whole, in devastating detail, by the one man who had been close enough to the center of the operation to actually know how all of it fit together. Reles, almost overnight, transformed in the eyes of law enforcement from a career criminal facing the chair into one of the single most valuable witnesses in the history of American organized crime prosecution. And in the eyes of his former associates, of the men he had once killed alongside, drunk alongside, built an entire criminal empire alongside, he transformed into something else entirely, the most dangerous man alive, a walking death sentence for anyone whose name he chose to speak, and simultaneously, by the code every one of them had lived under their whole adult lives, a man who now had to die, whatever the cost, before he could finish speaking. What followed was, in some ways, one of the strangest standoffs in the history of American law enforcement. O'Dwyer's office understood immediately what they had in Reles and understood, with equal clarity, that keeping him alive long enough to testify was now a matter of paramount importance, not just for the individual cases his testimony would support but for the entire strategy of using his knowledge to systematically dismantle murder, incorporated from the top down. A dead informant was worthless. Worse than worthless, a dead informant, killed while in the state's supposed protection, would signal to every other potential witness in every other case for years to come that cooperation was a death sentence regardless of what the authorities promised, poisoning the well for every future prosecution that might depend on someone inside the underworld deciding to talk. Reles had to be kept alive, and everyone involved, Reles himself most of all, understood exactly how difficult that was going to be, because the men Reles was now testifying against were not amateurs. They were professionals, men whose entire careers had been built around finding and eliminating exactly this kind of threat, men with resources, connections, and, crucially, an intimate understanding of exactly how police protection worked, because some of them had spent years paying to subvert it. The solution O'Dwyer's office arrived at was to place Reles under round-the-clock police guard, moving him between a series of hotel rooms rather than keeping him in any single fixed location for too long, on the theory that a moving target, watched constantly by armed officers, would be far harder to reach than a man sitting in an ordinary jail cell where corrupt guards or smuggled weapons might eventually find a way to him. It was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary level of protection for a single witness, the kind of security normally reserved for heads of state, applied to a Brooklyn street killer because the value of what was inside his head had become, quite literally, incalculable. And for a while, remarkably, it worked. Over the course of 1940 and into 1941, Reles' testimony began systematically feeding a series of prosecutions that shook the entire structure of organized crime in Brooklyn and beyond. Men who had once been his closest associates, killers he had worked alongside for years, men who considered themselves untouchable precisely because the code of silence had always held before, found themselves indicted, tried, and in several devastating cases, convicted and sentenced to death, on the strength of testimony that only a man who had been inside the operation as deeply as Reles had been could possibly have provided. It was, from the perspective of law enforcement, an almost unprecedented triumph, a demonstration that even an organization as disciplined and insulated as Murder, Incorporated could be broken apart from within, given the right combination of pressure and a witness willing to cross the one line that was supposed to be uncrossable. But every conviction Reles' testimony produced also raised the stakes of keeping him alive, because it multiplied, name by name and case by case, the number of extraordinarily dangerous men who now had every possible motive to see him dead before he could testify against the next one, and the next one after that. And looming over all of it, growing larger and more urgent with each passing month, was a specific name that Reles' testimony was inexorably building toward, a name that represented not some mid-level Brooklyn operator but one of the true architects of the national crime syndicate itself, Albert Anastasia, a man of such standing and such lethal reputation within organized crime that he would later become infamous under a nickname that captured exactly how the underworld regarded him, the Lord High Executioner. If Reles' testimony reached far enough, if he was allowed to live long enough to take the stand against a man at Anastasia's level, the implications would ripple outward through the entire national crime syndicate, not just its Brooklyn branch. Some historians and investigators who studied the case afterward would come to believe that it was specifically the prospect of Reles testifying against Anastasia that transformed the question of silencing him from a serious priority into an absolute, non-negotiable necessity for the highest levels of organized crime in America, that the 6 police officers guarding his door, however dedicated and however well-intentioned, were standing between one small, wiry, cold-eyed former Brownsville street kid and some of the most powerful and ruthless men the American underworld had ever produced. By the fall of 1941, Reles had been moved, for what would turn out to be the final time, into a room on the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel, a large, faded Coney Island resort building that had been repurposed to house him and his police detail, chosen in part for its relative isolation, sitting near the boardwalk with the Atlantic stretching out beyond it, a strange, almost surreal setting for what was, in effect, the most closely guarded witness protection operation New York had ever mounted. He had been in protective custody for well over a year at that point, moved from hotel to hotel, room to room, always under guard, always watched, his entire existence narrowed down to a small rotating cast of police detectives and the walls of whatever room he currently occupied. He had testified. He had produced, by any measure, one of the most consequential bodies of witness testimony in the history of American organized crime prosecution. And he was still, as November arrived, waiting to take the stand against Albert Anastasia himself, a case that, had it gone forward, might have changed the entire trajectory of organized crime in America. It never went forward. Because on the morning of November 12, 1941, before dawn, with 2 police officers supposedly inside his room and 4 more stationed immediately outside the door, Abe Reles went out the 6th-floor window of room 623 at the Half Moon Hotel and fell to his death on the roof of a lower extension of the building below. And in the moment his body was discovered, the single most valuable witness against organized crime in American history, the man whose testimony had already sent multiple killers to the electric chair, the man who was about to bring down one of the most powerful and feared figures in the entire national syndicate, was gone, and with him went any real chance that Albert Anastasia would ever face justice for the killings Reles had been prepared to describe under oath. We are going to spend real time, in the parts ahead, taking apart exactly what happened in that room, what the official investigation concluded, what the guards claimed to have seen and heard, and why, more than 80 years later, so many historians, journalists, and law enforcement officials who have studied the case still do not believe the official story. But before we get there, we need to understand who Reles actually was to the men now most desperate to silence him, and we need to understand the specific, extraordinary danger he posed to Albert Anastasia, because that relationship, more than anything else, is the key to understanding not just why Reles had to die, but why so many people came to believe that his death, whatever the official report said, was not an accident at all. To understand why 6 armed police officers were not enough to keep Abraham Reles alive, you first have to understand the specific weight of the man whose fate now hung on Reles' continued existence, because everything else in this story, the choice of hotel, the rotation of guards, the desperate secrecy around his location, even the strange, almost theatrical nature of his final hours, orbits around a single towering figure in the American underworld, Albert Anastasia. If Lucky Luciano was the architect of the modern national crime syndicate and Meyer Lansky was its accountant, Anastasia was, by near universal consensus among the men who knew him, its executioner in the most literal sense the word could carry. He held authority, by this point in his career, not merely over a piece of Brooklyn territory but over the entire apparatus of contract killing that Reles himself had helped build and run, which meant that in a very real, very direct sense, Anastasia was not simply another name on Reles' growing list of testimony targets. He was, in the structure of Murder, Incorporated, something closer to Reles' own ultimate superior, the man at the top of the chain of command whose authorization, whose orders, whose approval had stood behind an enormous number of the killings Reles had already testified to in painstaking detail against lesser men. Reles did not merely know things about Anastasia. Reles knew, with the precision of a man who had once worked directly within Anastasia's own operational structure, exactly how deeply implicated the man was in years of contract murders, and he was, as 1941 wore on, actively preparing to say so under oath, in open court, in a case that prosecutors believed could finally bring down the single most feared killer in the entire national syndicate. Anastasia's own rise mirrored Reles in certain unsettling ways, though it had unfolded on a larger stage and reached a far higher altitude. Born in Italy and arriving in America as a young man working the docks of Brooklyn, he had built his early reputation the same way so many men of his generation had, through violence applied without hesitation and without any apparent internal governor telling him when enough was enough. He had risen through the ranks of Brooklyn's Italian criminal underworld during the same Prohibition-era gang consolidations that had swept up Reles' Brownsville crew, and he had attached himself, at a crucial early moment, to the rising fortunes of Lucky Luciano, becoming one of the men Luciano trusted to carry out the kind of decisive, irreversible violence that cleared away the old guard, Mustache Pete, bosses who stood in the way of Luciano's vision for a modernized, syndicate-style, organized crime structure. Anastasia, by most accounts of underworld historians, was among the men directly involved in the killing of Salvatore Maranzano in 1931, an assassination that is often cited as the true founding moment of the modern American Mafia as a structured, commission-governed enterprise rather than a collection of warring, ego-driven fiefdoms. From that point forward, Anastasia's position within the syndicate was never in serious doubt. He became, over the following decade, the de facto overseer of contract killing operations tied to the Brooklyn waterfront rackets and, through his connections to men like Louis Buckleter, to the broader apparatus that Reles' own crew operated within. By the time Reles began cooperating with O'Dwyer's office, Anastasia was one of the 2 or 3 most powerful and most feared men in the entire New York underworld, a man whose temper was, by the accounts of people who worked closest to him, genuinely terrifying even by the standards of an industry built on terrifying men, prone to ordering executions over slights that other bosses would have simply absorbed or negotiated away. This was the man Reles was preparing to testify against. Not a mid-level Brownsville enforcer whose conviction, while satisfying, would leave the fundamental architecture of organized crime in New York largely intact. Anastasia sat close enough to the absolute top of the national syndicate that his prosecution, if it succeeded, threatened to send shockwaves through the entire structure, implicating not just Anastasia himself but potentially opening threads that could be pulled toward other men at his level, men who had spent their entire careers believing themselves insulated from exactly this kind of exposure by layers of intermediaries, by the code of silence, by the simple fact that no one who actually knew what they knew had ever been willing, or able, to talk. Reles was about to become the exception that proved it could be done, and every single man in the national syndicate with anything to fear from that precedent understood exactly what was at stake if he was allowed to take the stand. It is worth pausing on just how unusual it was, historically, for a witness to reach this level of proximity to a figure like Anastasia and survive long enough even to be scheduled to testify. The entire design of Murder, Incorporated, as Reles himself had explained to investigators in exhausting detail, existed specifically to prevent this kind of exposure. Killers were selected precisely because they had no personal connection to their targets. Orders moved through intermediaries specifically so that the men at the top could maintain what amounted to plausible deniability, and any operative who showed signs of becoming a liability, of talking too much, of drawing too much police attention, was dealt with swiftly and permanently, often by other members of the same organization, as both a practical security measure and a lesson broadcast to everyone else in the structure. Reles had, by his own later admissions to investigators, participated in exactly this kind of internal cleanup on more than one occasion, men suspected of talking, or simply judged to have become too unreliable or too exposed, quietly eliminated by their own former associates before they ever got the chance to become a Reles-style problem. He understood, in other words, precisely how the system was supposed to work to prevent what he himself was now doing. He had helped build the very mechanism that was now, with grim and possibly fatal irony, mobilizing to stop him. And mobilize it did. From the moment word began to spread through the underworld, and word inevitably spread, because a case of this magnitude could not be built in total secrecy, because witnesses being interviewed and grand juries being convened left traces that reached back into the very neighborhoods and networks Reles had come from, the pressure to eliminate him became, by every account gathered after the fact, one of the highest priorities of the entire national syndicate leadership, not merely a Brooklyn concern. This was not simply about protecting Anastasia individually, though that alone would have been more than sufficient motivation given his standing. It was about protecting the entire principle that had made the modern syndicate function as smoothly and profitably as it had for the past decade, the absolute, unbreakable expectation that men inside the organization did not talk, and that even in the rare cases where they did, the consequences would be so swift and so certain that the information would never actually make it into a courtroom. Reles' continued survival, testifying case after case, sending man after man to convictions and death sentences, was an open, walking refutation of that entire principle, and every day he remained alive and cooperating represented, to the men running the national syndicate, an escalating threat not just to Anastasia but to the stability of the whole system. This is the atmosphere into which the extraordinary security measures around Reles have to be understood. O'Dwyer's office was not being merely cautious. They were operating under the genuine, well-founded belief that essentially the entire apparatus of organized crime in America, or at minimum every man within reach of the syndicate's resources, was actively motivated and actively working to find a way to reach their witness, and that the resources available to the syndicate, money for bribes, connections inside police departments and hotel staffs and the court system itself, decades of experience finding and eliminating exactly this kind of target, were formidable enough that no ordinary precaution could be assumed to be sufficient. The decision to move Reles repeatedly between hotels, never leaving him in one location long enough for outside parties to organize against him, reflected a genuine and reasonable fear that any fixed location, however well guarded on paper, could eventually be compromised, whether through a bribed guard, an infiltrated staff member, or simply enough time for outside operatives to study the security pattern and find its weakness. The Half Moon Hotel itself, where Reles would spend his final weeks, was in some ways a strange choice and in other ways a logical one. It was a large, once Grand Coney Island resort hotel, built in the 1920s at the height of Coney Island's popularity as a beachfront destination for New Yorkers seeking an escape from the summer heat of the city, its scale and relative isolation from Manhattan's dense criminal networks making it, on paper, a reasonably defensible location, far enough from the old neighborhoods, close enough to the water that approach routes were limited, large enough that a police detail could occupy an entire floor or wing without drawing excessive attention. Reles was installed in room 623, on the 6th floor, a room chosen, according to later accounts, in part because its height and the layout of the building were believed to make it difficult for anyone to reach from outside. 6 officers were assigned to guard him around the clock, working in shifts, with the specific arrangement, later scrutinized in exhaustive and often contradictory detail during the investigations that followed his death, generally described as 2 officers stationed inside the room itself and additional officers posted in the hallway outside, a level of coverage that, on paper, should have made it essentially impossible for anyone to reach Reles without being seen, heard, or stopped. And yet within this fortress of supposed protection, something had already begun to erode, something less dramatic than a bribed guard or an infiltrated assassin but in its own way just as dangerous to Reles' survival, the simple, grinding psychological toll of over a year spent in what amounted to a permanent, rotating captivity, watched constantly, moved constantly, unable to see his family except under tightly controlled and monitored circumstances, unable to walk outside, unable to do anything resembling a normal life, waiting month after month for a trial date against a man as powerful and as patient as Albert Anastasia. Reles was, by multiple accounts from people who interacted with him during this period, drinking heavily, restless, prone to volatile moods, a man whose entire identity had been built around control, around being the one who calculated the angles and dictated outcomes to others, now reduced to a kind of permanent dependency on the police officers guarding him, his fate no longer entirely in his own hands in the way it had been for his entire adult life up to that point. Some who studied the case afterward have wondered whether this psychological strain played some role in what happened on the night of November 11th into the morning of November 12th, whether a man worn down by more than a year of confinement, however comfortable the hotel rooms themselves might have been compared to an actual prison cell, might have made some choice, taken some risk, that a calmer, more patient version of himself would never have taken. But there is another current running beneath the official narrative of psychological strain and accidental risk-taking, a current that grew stronger rather than weaker as the years passed and as more people with direct knowledge of Brooklyn law enforcement in this era spoke, on and off the record, about what they believed had actually happened at the Half Moon Hotel. Because even accounting for everything, the drinking, the restlessness, the long months of confinement, there remained a series of facts about the security arrangement and about the physical circumstances of Reles' death that a great many people, then and now, found deeply difficult to reconcile with any innocent explanation. The guards assigned to protect Reles were not, as it happened, simply anonymous officers pulled at random from the general ranks of the New York Police Department. Brooklyn law enforcement in this era, even amid O'Dwyer's genuine and aggressive push against organized crime, remained an institution with a long and well-documented history of corruption, of officers who owed favors, took payments, or maintained relationships stretching back years with exactly the kind of underworld figures now desperate to see Reles silenced. The syndicate's reach into police departments, into the court system, into the machinery of city government itself, had been one of the central enabling conditions of organized crime's power in New York for decades, and there was no obvious reason to assume that reach simply evaporated the moment a particular squad of officers was assigned to guard a specific witness in a specific hotel room, however much O'Dwyer's office might have hoped and intended otherwise. As November 11, 1941, gave way to the early hours of November 12. Reles was, according to the accounts later given by the officers on duty, in his room as he had been on countless nights before, with the guard rotation proceeding as it always did. What exactly happened between the last confirmed sighting of him alive and the discovery of his body on the roof of the hotel's lower kitchen extension, 6 floors below his window, would become one of the most exhaustively investigated, and most persistently disputed, sequences of events in the entire history of American organized crime cases. A sequence that official investigators would ultimately rule an accident, that many journalists and historians would come to regard as almost certainly something else entirely, and that not a single person directly responsible for Reles' supervision that night would ever be able to fully or convincingly explain. Every account of what happened in the early morning hours of November 12, 1941, begins in essentially the same place, with essentially the same simple, almost mundane facts, before it dissolves, almost immediately, into contradiction and uncertainty that would never fully resolve. Abe Reles had spent the evening of November 11 in room 623 of the Half Moon Hotel, as he had spent so many evenings before it, under the watch of the police detail assigned to guard him. By the accounts later collected from the officers on duty that night, nothing about the evening had seemed unusual. There had been no reported disturbance, no visitors, no indication that anything out of the ordinary was unfolding behind the door of that 6th-floor room. Reles, according to those same accounts, had gone to bed at a reasonable hour, and the officers on duty had settled into the familiar routine of a long overnight shift, the kind of shift that, after more than a year of guarding the same man in one hotel room after another, had presumably long since lost whatever tension or vigilance it might have carried in its earliest weeks and had instead settled into something closer to tedium, the particular, dangerous tedium of a job that has never once, in a very long time, produced an actual crisis, and that therefore begins, almost imperceptibly, to be performed with less than full attention. At some point in the very early hours of the morning, the exact timeline itself would become a matter of dispute and reconstruction rather than clear, agreed-upon fact. Someone, whether hotel staff arriving for early morning duties or a passerby or one of the guards themselves conducting some kind of routine check, noticed something on the roof of the hotel's kitchen extension, a lower, flatter section of the building's roofline sitting well below the level of the 6th floor. It was a body. It was Abe Reles, and he was dead, having fallen, or, in the version of events that so many would come to doubt, having fallen while attempting to climb down or across the building's exterior using a rope improvised from knotted bed sheets and other materials from his room, from the window of room 623, 6 full stories above where his body now lay. The official response, once the body was identified and the magnitude of what had happened became clear, moved with the kind of urgency you would expect when the single most important witness in the largest organized crime investigation in the city's history turns up dead on a rooftop while under 24-hour police guard. Investigators descended on the Half Moon Hotel. The room was examined. The guards on duty were questioned, and questioned again after that, over the following days and weeks, as the initial, hurried accounts began to accumulate the kind of small but persistent inconsistencies that made experienced investigators uneasy even as the official machinery of the case began moving, almost immediately, toward a conclusion that many of those same investigators, and a great many more people outside the investigation entirely, would come to find deeply unsatisfying. The physical evidence, as it was presented in the official account, ran roughly as follows. In room 623, investigators found bed sheets that had been tied together, along with what were described as other pieces of material, a length of wire or cord, depending on which account you read, and possibly a radiator or piece of furniture that could have served as an anchor point, arranged in a manner consistent with an attempt to lower oneself, or to descend using some improvised rope-like device, out the window and down the face of the building. This became, almost immediately, the foundation of the theory that the police department and the district attorney's office would ultimately settle upon and present, in various forms, to the public, that Reles, for reasons of his own, had attempted some kind of escape or unauthorized departure from the hotel in the pre-dawn hours, using an improvised rope of knotted bedsheets to try to climb down from his 6th-floor window, and that somewhere in this attempt, the material had failed, or his grip had failed, or some combination of exhaustion and physical miscalculation had caused him to fall the remaining distance to his death on the roof below. It is worth sitting, for a moment, with just how strange this explanation was on its face, even setting aside every question of underworld conspiracy and syndicate reach into police corruption that would come to dominate the case in the years that followed. Reles was not, by any formal or practical definition, a prisoner. He was a protected witness, cooperating voluntarily with the district attorney's office, held under guard not to prevent him from leaving but to prevent outside parties from reaching him. He had, by every account of his relationship with O'Dwyer's investigators, a good working rapport with the men prosecuting his case, understood clearly the value of his own testimony and the protection it bought him, and had every rational incentive in the world to remain exactly where he was until his testimony against Anastasia and the other remaining targets of the investigation had been completed. Why would a man in that position, a man who had spent more than a year cooperating precisely because he understood that his survival depended on staying inside police protection rather than outside it, suddenly decide, in the middle of the night, to attempt a dangerous, physically demanding escape down the face of a 6-story building, using nothing but knotted bedsheets, into a Coney Island night, with nowhere obviously safer to go and every reason to believe that stepping outside the protection of his police guard was the single most dangerous thing he could possibly do? The official theory never provided a fully satisfying answer to this most basic and most obvious question, and its failure to do so is, more than any single piece of physical evidence, the reason the case has remained a subject of doubt and speculation for more than 80 years. Some versions of the official account attempted to address this by suggesting that Reles might not have been trying to escape in any permanent sense at all, but rather attempting some kind of prank or ill-considered practical joke on his guards, perhaps trying to sneak down to another floor or slip out briefly to see his wife, or simply engaging in some kind of reckless, restless behavior born out of the psychological strain of over a year in confinement, without any real intention of abandoning the protection of the investigation altogether. Other versions leaned harder into the theory that Reles, growing increasingly anxious and paranoid as his testimony against Anastasia approached, had begun to genuinely doubt whether the police guard assigned to protect him could actually be trusted, and had decided, in a moment of panic or miscalculated self-preservation, that his safest option was to attempt to leave the hotel entirely under his own power, trusting his own instincts for survival, the instincts that had kept him alive through 15 years of gang violence, over the men supposedly guarding his door. Neither explanation, when weighed against everything else known about Reles' character, his intelligence, and his evident understanding of exactly how much danger he was in outside of police protection, has ever struck the majority of people who have studied this case as genuinely convincing. Then there is the question of the sheets themselves, which became, almost immediately, one of the most scrutinized and most disputed pieces of physical evidence in the entire case. Accounts differ, depending on which investigator or which later retelling you consult, but a persistent and troubling detail recurs across many of them, that the sheets found in connection with Reles' supposed escape attempt were, according to some witnesses and some early reports, found neatly folded, rather than in the kind of disheveled, knotted, obviously just been used for a desperate climb condition you would expect from a rope that had actually been employed in a genuine, high-stakes escape attempt just hours or even minutes earlier. This detail, when it surfaced and began to circulate, struck many observers as almost impossible to reconcile with the official story. A man does not tie sheets together, use them to attempt a 6-story descent down the exterior of a building, fall to his death partway through the attempt, and leave behind evidence that appears neatly folded rather than knotted, twisted, and disturbed in the way genuine use would produce. If the sheets were staged, arranged after the fact to support a particular narrative about what had happened, rather than genuinely used in the manner the official story claimed, then the entire foundation of the accidental fall during escape attempt theory begins to look less like a careful reconstruction of events and more like a story assembled, after the fact, to explain away a death that had actually occurred by some entirely different means. The behavior and testimony of the guards themselves added further layers of difficulty to the official account rather than resolving them. In a security arrangement supposedly involving 2 officers stationed inside the room and additional officers immediately outside in the hallway, the most basic and unavoidable question that any competent investigation would need to answer was simple: how does a man climb out a window, tie together bedsheets, attempt a 6-story descent, and fall to his death, without a single one of the officers charged with watching him at every moment noticing any part of this happening? The answers offered by the guards on duty that night were, by most accounts of the subsequent inquiry, vague, inconsistent with one another in various small but significant details, and in several cases seemed to describe periods during which officers who were supposed to be maintaining constant, direct observation of Reles had, for one reason or another, not actually been looking at him or been present in the room at all. Some accounts described officers who had fallen asleep during their shift. Others suggested that the officers inside the room had, at some point during the night, left it briefly, whether for a bathroom break, to confer with colleagues in the hallway, or for some other reason that was never fully or convincingly established. None of these explanations, individually or collectively, provided a coherent picture of how a security detail specifically assembled and specifically tasked with preventing exactly this kind of outcome had failed so completely and so conveniently at the precise moment when the outcome it existed to prevent actually occurred. It was this pattern, not any single smoking gun, but the accumulation of small, unresolved, mutually reinforcing inconsistencies across the physical evidence, the guard's testimony, and the basic implausibility of the motive itself, that led the official investigation, even as it ultimately settled on an accidental death finding, to leave behind a public record shot through with unresolved doubt. The medical examination of Reles' body was consistent with a fall from a significant height, which was never seriously disputed by anyone. The dispute was never really about how he died in the most narrow physical sense, but about how he came to be falling from that window in the first place, and about whether the story assembled to explain that fall reflected what had genuinely happened, or reflected a story constructed, with greater or lesser degrees of official knowledge and complicity, to cover for something considerably darker. Almost immediately, alternative theories began to circulate, both within law enforcement circles and in the broader public conversation that followed as newspapers seized on the case, and these theories have, in various forms, persisted and been refined and argued over in the decades since. The most straightforward of these alternative theories holds that Reles was, in fact, deliberately killed, thrown from the window, whether after being rendered unconscious or otherwise incapacitated, or simply overpowered and pushed by someone who had gained access to the room, with the knotted sheets tableau staged afterward to create the appearance of an accidental escape attempt gone wrong, precisely because a staged accident was a far less politically explosive outcome, for everyone involved, than an acknowledged assassination of a protected witness carried out under the nose of his own police guard. If this is what actually happened, the obvious and immediately damning question becomes who, exactly, could have gained the necessary access, because a stranger, an outside operative with no connection to the guard detail itself, would have faced enormous, arguably insurmountable obstacles in reaching a room supposedly watched by 6 officers around the clock, in a hotel where the entire security arrangement existed specifically to prevent outside access. This is where the darker, more institutionally troubling version of the theory takes hold, that the access required did not come from outside the guard detail at all, but from within it, that one or more of the officers charged with protecting Reles had, whether through direct payment, long-standing loyalty, intimidation, or some combination of all three, been compromised by the very organization whose survival depended on Reles never reaching the witness stand against Albert Anastasia. This theory gained considerable traction not because any single officer was ever definitively proven, in a court of law, to have participated in or facilitated Reles' death, but because it fit so coherently with everything else known about the case, the plausibility gap in the official motive, the troubling condition of the physical evidence, the vague and inconsistent guard testimony, and, perhaps most damningly of all, the broader, well-documented history of exactly this kind of corruption within Brooklyn law enforcement in this era, a history that made the idea of a compromised guard detail not some far-fetched conspiracy theory but a genuinely plausible, almost mundane explanation given everything else known about how organized crime had operated in New York for the preceding 2 decades. It also fit, with an almost eerie precision, the timing of Reles' death relative to his scheduled testimony against Anastasia, a coincidence so favorable to the syndicate's interests, occurring at precisely the moment it occurred, that many investigators and journalists who studied the case in the years that followed simply could not accept that it had happened by pure chance, through nothing more than an ill-advised, unauthorized escape attempt by a restless, sleep-deprived witness. The official investigation into Reles' death, despite the doubts swirling around it from almost the first hours after his body was discovered, was ultimately closed with a ruling of accidental death, a conclusion that satisfied almost no one who had followed the case closely, and that would go on to be revisited, re-argued, and relitigated in newspaper accounts, in books, in later official inquiries into police corruption, for decades afterward, without ever arriving at a definitive alternative conclusion that could be proven with the same certainty the official finding claimed for itself. What the official ruling could not undo, however, was the practical, immediate, and catastrophic consequence of Reles' death for the case against Albert Anastasia specifically. Without Reles' testimony, without the singular, irreplaceable body of first-hand knowledge that only he possessed, the case against Anastasia collapsed. He was never tried for the killings Reles had been prepared to describe under oath. He would go on to survive for more than 15 additional years after Reles' death, continuing to operate at the highest levels of organized crime, before finally meeting his own violent end in 1957, gunned down in a barbershop chair in circumstances that carried their own eerie echoes of the world Reles had once helped run. For Anastasia, and for the broader national syndicate whose stability had been so gravely threatened by Reles' cooperation, the outcome at the Half Moon Hotel could not have been more favorable, whatever combination of chance, negligence, or deliberate action had actually produced it. News of Abe Reles' death spread through New York with the particular, electric speed reserved for stories that managed to be simultaneously shocking and, to anyone paying close attention, almost predictable. The newspapers of November 1941 seized on it immediately, and within days the story had acquired the shorthand that would follow it for the rest of the century and beyond, a grim, almost darkly comic phrase that captured the entire absurdity and horror of the situation in 5 words: the canary who could sing but couldn't fly. It was the kind of line that tabloid writers dream of, cruel and clever in equal measure, and it stuck precisely because it distilled, with brutal economy, the central, unresolved question haunting the entire case, that a man who had proven himself capable of an extraordinary feat, breaking the underworld's most sacred code of silence and singing in exhaustive, devastating detail to prosecutors for well over a year, had somehow failed at the comparatively simple physical task of climbing safely out a window, if that was even what he had actually been attempting to do at all. For William O'Dwyer and his office, the death landed as something considerably worse than an embarrassment. It represented the collapse of what had been, up to that point, the single most successful and far-reaching prosecution of organized crime in the city's history, a case that had already sent multiple killers to convictions and to the electric chair and that had been building, methodically, toward the kind of culminating prosecution, Albert Anastasia himself, that could have fundamentally altered the balance of power within the national crime syndicate. All of that forward momentum stopped, almost instantly, the moment Reles' body was found on that rooftop. There was no substitute witness capable of replicating what Reles alone had known. The prosecution against Anastasia, lacking its central witness, could not proceed, and with it went the broader ambition of using the murder, incorporated prosecutions as a mechanism for reaching all the way to the top of the national syndicate's command structure. O'Dwyer, who would go on in the years following to be elected mayor of New York City, found himself dogged for the rest of his public career by questions about Reles' death, questions about whether his office had done enough to protect its witness, questions about how deeply corruption had penetrated the police detail specifically assigned to guard him, and, eventually and more damagingly, questions about whether O'Dwyer himself, as his political career carried him closer to and eventually into connections with figures whose integrity would later be seriously challenged, had ever had reason to want the Anastasia prosecution to quietly disappear. The immediate institutional response to Reles' death was an investigation into the conduct of the police officers who had been guarding him, and this investigation, however thoroughly it was conducted on paper, produced results that satisfied almost no one who examined them closely. The officers on duty that night were questioned extensively, and their accounts, as had already become apparent in the earliest hours after the discovery of the body, simply did not add up to a coherent, convincing narrative of a security detail that had performed its function with anything resembling the vigilance the situation demanded. There were gaps in the timeline that no one could adequately fill. There were contradictions between different officers' accounts of who had been where, and when, and what they had or had not observed. There was the persistent, nagging problem of the neatly folded sheets, a detail that never received a satisfying official explanation and that continued to circulate, in newspaper accounts and later historical treatments of the case, as one of the single most damning pieces of evidence against the official theory of an accidental death during a genuine escape attempt. What the investigation into the guard's conduct never definitively established, however, and what it was perhaps never realistically going to be able to establish given the institutional incentives working against a truly independent inquiry, was whether the failures on display that night reflected simple, ordinary human negligence, tired officers on a long, monotonous overnight shift, cutting corners after more than a year of uneventful duty, making the kind of small, human errors that eventually catch up with anyone tasked with sustained vigilance over an extended period, or whether they reflected something considerably more deliberate, officers who had, in one way or another, been persuaded, paid, or pressured to create exactly the kind of opportunity that had apparently been exploited that night. This distinction mattered enormously, not just for the individual reputations and legal exposure of the officers involved, but for the broader public's understanding of just how deeply organized crime's influence had penetrated the very institutions that were supposedly working to dismantle it. An investigation that concluded simple negligence was, in its own way, a relatively comfortable finding for the department and for the city's political establishment, embarrassing but not fundamentally destabilizing. An investigation that concluded deliberate corruption within the specific detail assigned to protect the state's most valuable witness would have been an altogether more serious indictment, not just of individual officers but of the entire system O'Dwyer's prosecution had been operating within, and it would have raised the deeply uncomfortable question of exactly how far up the chain that corruption might have reached, and who else, beyond the individual officers on duty that night, might have known, or suspected, or even facilitated what had happened. The official findings, in the end, never went that far. No officer was ever definitively proven, in a manner that satisfied the standards of criminal prosecution, to have deliberately facilitated Reles' death, and the case, insofar as any formal legal proceeding addressed it at all, concluded with disciplinary findings of negligence rather than conspiracy. But the gap between that official conclusion and the broader public and journalistic understanding of what had likely actually happened only widened in the years that followed, as more people with direct or indirect knowledge of Brooklyn law enforcement and organized crime in this era spoke, on and off the record, about their own beliefs regarding what had truly occurred at the Half Moon Hotel. Journalists who covered organized crime through the following decades returned to the Reles case again and again, treating it not as a settled matter but as one of the enduring open wounds of New York's 20th-century relationship with organized crime, a case whose official resolution had never actually resolved anything, and whose true circumstances, whatever they were, had likely died along with the small handful of people who might have actually known the truth of what happened in room 623 that night. Among the theories that gained the most traction in the years following Reles' death was one that implicated, with varying degrees of directness, figures considerably higher up the chain of command than the individual officers who had been on duty that specific night. Some investigators and journalists came to believe that the order to eliminate Reles, whatever form its execution actually took, had originated at a level of organized crime leadership high enough, and with resources deep enough, to reach into the police department itself through channels that had nothing to do with the individual loyalty or corruption of any single beat officer. Channels instead built on decades of established relationships between organized crime figures and specific individuals within the department's command structure, relationships that had allowed the syndicate to exert influence over investigations, prosecutions, and, in this case, allegedly, witness security arrangements for years before Reles' death and that would continue to shape the department's relationship with organized crime for years afterward. Under this theory, the specific officers on duty on the night of November 11 into November 12 may have been, in a sense, almost incidental to the outcome, not necessarily the men who made the deliberate decision to create an opportunity for Reles' death, but simply the particular individuals whose shift happened to coincide with a plan that had been set in motion through channels considerably above their own pay grade, men who may have been instructed, through some combination of direct order and institutional pressure, to simply not look too closely at whatever unfolded during a specific window of time, without necessarily being told, or needing to be told, exactly what that unfolding would involve. This kind of theory, admittedly, moves into territory that can never be fully proven with the kind of hard evidentiary certainty a court of law would require, and it is worth being honest about that limitation even while taking the theory seriously, because it is precisely the kind of theory that could describe what actually happened, or could equally describe an understandable, human tendency to seek a more satisfying, more coherent explanation for an event whose official account never adequately explained itself. What can be said with considerably more confidence, because it rests not on speculation about hidden motives but on the documented historical record of policing and organized crime in this era, is that the institutional conditions necessary for exactly this kind of corruption to have occurred were unambiguously present in Brooklyn law enforcement in 1941. That similar patterns of corrupted witness security and compromised investigations had occurred before and would occur again in the decades that followed, and that the specific individuals and institutions with the strongest possible motive to see Reles silenced, Albert Anastasia most directly, but by extension the entire national syndicate leadership whose stability depended on the code of silence remaining unbroken, possessed exactly the kind of financial and institutional resources that would have made compromising a handful of Brooklyn police officers a comparatively modest and entirely achievable undertaking, set against the enormous stakes involved. Beyond the specific question of what had happened to the guard detail, Reles' death also carried broader consequences for the entire strategy of using cooperating witnesses to dismantle organized crime, consequences that rippled outward through law enforcement circles for years afterward. Prosecutors across the country who might otherwise have pursued similar strategies, flipping insiders, building cases from the inside out rather than relying purely on external investigation, now had to reckon with a genuinely chilling precedent. If the single most valuable, most closely guarded, most carefully protected witness in the history of American organized crime prosecution could still end up dead under circumstances that strongly suggested his own protectors had failed him, whether through negligence or something considerably worse, then what confidence could any future potential witness reasonably have that cooperation would actually keep them alive long enough to see a case through to conviction? This was, from the perspective of organized crime figures across the country who had watched the Reles case unfold with understandable and intense interest, precisely the message his death was best understood to send, whether or not it had been deliberately engineered for that specific purpose. The code of silence had, for one dangerous stretch of months, appeared genuinely breakable, appeared capable of producing exactly the kind of systematic, top-to-bottom prosecutions that could have fundamentally reshaped organized crime's position in American life. Reles' death, however it had actually occurred, restored the previous, comfortable equilibrium, an equilibrium in which the risks of talking to the authorities, even under the most extensive protection the state could offer, remained too severe, too existential, for all but the most desperate or most reckless men to seriously contemplate. The men Reles had already testified against, of course, could take no comfort in this restored equilibrium, because the convictions his testimony had already produced remained in place regardless of what happened to him afterward, and several of his former associates, men he had once run with through the streets of Brownsville, men who had once considered him a trusted partner in an organization built on shared blood and shared secrets, went to their deaths in the electric chair at Sing Sing. In the months and years following Reles' own death, convicted substantially or entirely on the strength of testimony from a man who was no longer alive to be cross-examined, no longer alive to answer questions about his own credibility or his own motives, no longer alive, in the most basic and unavoidable sense, to see the final consequences of the choice he had made. There is a particular, grim symmetry to this outcome that seems almost too neat for reality and yet is simply and verifiably what happened. Reles' death did not save the men he had already implicated. His testimony, preserved in trial transcripts and in the corroborating testimony of other witnesses his information had helped develop, continued to do its work long after he himself was gone, sending men to the same fate that so many of Murder, Incorporated's own victims had met at their hands over the preceding decade and a half. Only Anastasia, the single most consequential target of Reles' cooperation, the man whose prosecution had represented the true culmination of everything Reles' testimony had been building toward, escaped entirely, walking free from any consequence connected to Reles' knowledge of his crimes, protected in the most literal and final sense by the death of the one man who could have brought him down. In the years that followed, as the initial shock of Reles' death faded and the broader public moved on to other headlines, the case settled into a peculiar kind of historical limbo, never formally reopened, never definitively resolved, referenced periodically in later investigations into police corruption and organized crime, invoked by journalists and historians as a kind of shorthand for the limits of the state's ability to protect even its most valuable witnesses from an underworld determined and resourced enough to reach them. William O'Dwyer's own subsequent career, which carried him to the mayoralty of New York City and later to a diplomatic post as ambassador to Mexico, remained permanently shadowed by questions about the Reles case, questions that resurfaced with particular force during later organized crime investigations, including the Kefauver Committee hearings of the early 1950s, which examined organized crime's influence across American cities and revisited, among many other cases, the unresolved circumstances of Reles' death and the broader pattern of corruption within Brooklyn law enforcement that his case had exposed without ever fully explaining. What remains, more than 8 decades later, is a case that occupies a strange and enduring place in American criminal history, not a mystery in the sense of a puzzle with a hidden solution waiting to be discovered, because so many of the people who might have known the actual truth are long dead, and the physical evidence that might have definitively resolved the question was never preserved or examined with the kind of rigor a modern investigation would apply. It is, instead, a case that stands as a monument to a particular kind of institutional failure and a particular kind of underworld power, a demonstration that even a witness protected by the full, direct attention of a determined district attorney's office, guarded around the clock by half a dozen armed police officers, moved repeatedly between secure locations specifically to prevent exactly the outcome that ultimately occurred, could still, in the end up dead under circumstances that the official record was never able to convincingly explain. Whether Abe Reles fell, jumped, or was thrown from that 6th-floor window remains, formally, an open question. But the practical effect of his death was never in doubt, and it is that effect, the collapse of the case against Albert Anastasia, the restoration of the underworld's confidence that its code of silence remained, in the final and most important sense, unbreakable, that has made the story of Kid Twist's fall from the Half Moon Hotel endure as one of the darkest and most instructive chapters in the entire history of American organized crime. There is a particular kind of case that refuses to stay buried, and the death of Abe Reles is one of the purest examples of it in the entire history of American crime reporting. For every decade that has passed since that November morning in 1941, someone, a journalist chasing an anniversary story, a historian working through old police files, a true crime writer looking for the definitive account, a documentary crew hunting for fresh angles on an old mystery, has returned to the Half Moon Hotel and tried, once again, to settle the question that the original investigation never actually settled. And each time, the same fundamental problem reasserts itself: the physical evidence was compromised or lost decades ago, the people who might have known the truth are all dead, and what remains is a body of circumstantial material, contradictory testimony, and institutional motive so tangled that it supports several competing narratives simultaneously, none of which can be definitively proven and none of which can be definitively ruled out. The first and most straightforward alternative theory, the one closest in spirit to what a great many contemporaries believed within days of Reles' death, holds that he was murdered by men who gained direct access to room 623 with the active or passive cooperation of at least some of the officers assigned to guard him. In this version of events, one or more members of the guard detail either stepped away deliberately, created a gap in coverage at a prearranged time, or simply looked the other way while intruders entered the room, subdued or killed Reles inside, and then staged the scene, the knotted, oddly folded sheets, the open window, the positioning of the body on the roof extension below, to support the appearance of a bungled escape attempt rather than an assassination. Proponents of this theory point to several details that, taken together, strain the credibility of the official account: the persistent reports that the sheets were found in a condition inconsistent with having actually been used to descend the building, the vague, shifting, and mutually inconsistent testimony offered by the guards themselves in the days and weeks after the death, and the sheer physical implausibility of a man successfully and silently rigging an improvised rope, opening a window, and beginning a 6-story descent down the exterior of a building, all without alerting a single one of the several armed officers supposedly stationed in the room and immediately outside its door. Under this theory, the guards were not passive, unlucky bystanders to an unforeseeable tragedy. They were, whether through direct payment, long-standing relationships with organized crime figures predating their assignment to the Reles detail, or simple intimidation, active or complicit participants in a plan that had been arranged well before that particular night's shift began. A second theory, somewhat less dramatic but arguably even more damning in its institutional implications, holds that Reles was not murdered by outside intruders at all, but was thrown from the window by one or more of the guards themselves, that the very men assigned to protect him were the instruments of his death, acting on orders or incentives that had reached them through channels connecting Brooklyn's police department to the upper echelons of organized crime. This theory draws its plausibility from the well-documented, extensively chronicled history of corruption within the New York Police Department in this era, a history that would be examined at painful length in the years following Reles' death, as later investigations turned up example after example of officers who maintained ongoing financial relationships with organized crime figures, who provided advance warning of raids and investigations, who steered cases, buried evidence, and in some documented instances participated far more directly in criminal enterprises than the department's public image ever acknowledged. If a guard detail assigned to protect the state's most valuable witness against organized crime could itself have been compromised by that same organized crime, the outcome at the Half Moon Hotel would represent not some extraordinary anomaly but simply the most consequential and most visible instance of a pattern that had likely played out, in smaller and less publicized ways, many times before across the department. A third theory, quieter and less sensational than the first two but taken seriously by a number of people who studied the case closely, holds that Reles' death may indeed have involved some kind of genuine, if catastrophically miscalculated, attempt on his own part to leave the room, not necessarily an escape from custody in the sense of fleeing the investigation altogether, but perhaps a more limited, more personal act, an attempt to visit his wife without official sanction, or simply an act of restless, alcohol-fueled impulsiveness born out of the psychological strain of well over a year spent in close, monitored confinement. Under this theory, the guard's negligence was real but was ordinary human negligence rather than deliberate corruption. Officers who had, after so many uneventful months, simply stopped believing that anything genuinely dangerous could happen on their watch, officers who dozed, or stepped out, or simply failed to notice what their witness was doing in the room behind them, not because they had been paid to fail but because sustained vigilance over such an extended and uneventful period is, as a simple matter of human psychology, extraordinarily difficult to maintain. This theory does not require any grand conspiracy reaching into the police department's command structure. It requires only ordinary institutional failure, compounded by a witness whose own judgment, worn thin by confinement and stress, led him to take a risk that, under any circumstances, could easily have proven fatal even without any external interference at all. Each of these theories has its defenders, and each has real, substantive problems that its defenders have never been able to fully resolve. The murder by intruders theory struggles to explain exactly how outside operatives, with no apparent inside knowledge of the guard rotation or the room-specific security arrangements at that specific moment, managed to execute such a precise and successful operation on a night when, by every account, nothing about the security arrangement had been publicly altered or weakened in any detectable way. The murder by guards theory struggles with the fact that no guard was ever definitively proven, through confession, physical evidence, or independent corroboration, to have actually participated in Reles' death, despite extensive investigation and despite the strong institutional and political incentive that later investigators, particularly during the Kefauver hearings of the early 1950s, would have had to expose exactly this kind of corruption if solid evidence of it had actually existed. And the accidental death through negligence theory struggles, as it always has, with the basic question of motive: why a man as intelligent, as calculating, and as thoroughly aware of the mortal danger waiting for him outside police protection as Reles undeniably was would take an action so obviously, catastrophically risky, for reasons that no version of the theory has ever been able to identify with real confidence. It was into this atmosphere of unresolved suspicion that the Kefauver Committee arrived in the early 1950s, a Senate committee chaired by Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver that conducted a sweeping, nationally televised investigation into organized crime's influence across American cities. An investigation that captured the public imagination in a way few congressional hearings before or since have managed to replicate, in part because the hearings were broadcast live, bringing the faces and Voices of organized crime figures and the law enforcement officials who dealt with them directly into American living rooms for the first time. The Kefauver Committee's investigation ranged across the entire landscape of post-war organized crime, but its examination of New York inevitably returned, again and again, to the unresolved legacy of murder, incorporated, and to the specific, still unexplained circumstances of Reles' death, which by this point had become, in the decades since it occurred, something close to a symbol, shorthand, in the public imagination and in the imagination of law enforcement officials nationwide, for everything that could go wrong when organized crime's reach extended into the very institutions meant to combat it. William O'Dwyer himself, by this point serving as United States ambassador to Mexico after his tenure as mayor of New York City, found himself called before the Kefauver Committee to answer questions about his handling of the Reles case and about broader allegations of corruption and organized crime influence that had trailed his political career since his years as Brooklyn District Attorney. His testimony, examined closely by historians in the decades since, did little to resolve the central questions surrounding Reles' death, and in some respects deepened rather than dispelled the suspicions that had followed the case from its earliest days. O'Dwyer defended his office's handling of the witness protection arrangement, maintained that the death had been a tragic accident rather than any kind of deliberate act, and pushed back against suggestions that corruption within his own office or within the Brooklyn Police Department had played any role in what happened. But the committee's broader findings regarding the extent of organized crime's penetration into municipal government and law enforcement across the country, including in New York specifically, made it considerably harder for the public, and for many of the journalists and historians who continued to examine the Reles case in the years that followed, to simply accept the original accidental death finding at face value, especially given how conveniently that finding had served the interests of the very organization whose survival had depended on Reles never reaching the witness stand. Journalistic interest in the case never fully faded in the decades that followed, resurfacing periodically whenever public attention turned back toward organized crime's history in New York, whether through anniversary retrospectives, through books examining the broader history of murder, incorporated and its central figures, or through renewed public fascination with the Mafia more generally during periods when high-profile prosecutions or popular entertainment brought organized crime back into cultural focus. Writers who returned to the case in these later decades generally found themselves working with essentially the same limited body of evidence that had existed from the earliest days of the investigation, the same physical evidence, largely unchanged and unable to be re-examined with any modern forensic techniques given how much time had passed and how little of the original material had been carefully preserved. The same guard testimony, frozen in the form it had taken during the original inquiry, since every officer involved was, by this point, long since retired or deceased and unavailable for any kind of fresh interview that might have shed new light on what they had actually witnessed or failed to witness that night. What these later writers could offer, and what many of them did offer with real skill and real diligence, was a more sophisticated understanding of the broader institutional context surrounding the case, a clearer picture, informed by decades of subsequent research into organized crime's history and into the specific patterns of police corruption that had characterized New York law enforcement in the 1930s and 1940s, of just how plausible the darker theories surrounding Reles' death genuinely were, even in the absence of any single, definitive piece of proof that could settle the matter beyond dispute. It is worth noting, too, how the case came to function within the broader mythology of organized crime as it developed in American popular culture over the following decades. Reles' fall from the Half Moon Hotel became one of the touchstone stories cited whenever organized crime's reach into law enforcement needed to be illustrated in vivid, memorable terms, a story that captured, more effectively than almost any other single incident from this era, the seductive and terrifying idea that no one, not even a man under the direct, 24-hour protection of the state itself, was ever truly beyond the underworld's reach if the underworld wanted badly enough to reach him. This mythological weight, this status as a kind of foundational parable about the limits of institutional protection against organized crime's influence, has if anything made the case harder rather than easier to examine with full historical objectivity, because so much of what has been written and said about it over the decades carries, whether consciously or not, the narrative shape of a story being told for its dramatic and symbolic power rather than a case being examined purely for its evidentiary content. That does not mean the darker theories are wrong. It means, simply, that separating what is genuinely supported by the historical record from what has been added, embellished, or simply assumed over 8 decades of retelling requires a particular kind of care that not every treatment of the case, including some of the more sensationalized popular accounts that have circulated over the years, has always been willing to exercise. What can be said, with real confidence, sitting here more than 80 years removed from that November morning, is this: the official finding of accidental death, however it was reached and whatever internal political and institutional pressures shaped its conclusions, has never commanded genuine confidence among the historians, journalists, and law enforcement professionals who have studied the case most closely in the decades since. The specific mechanism of Reles' death, murder by intruders, murder by his own guards, or a genuine, catastrophically unlucky accident born of his own restlessness and poor judgment, remains, in the strictest and most honest sense, unresolved and very likely unresolvable at this distance in time. But the broader truth the case reveals, regardless of which specific theory comes closest to what actually happened in room 623 that night, is not really in dispute at all: that organized crime in America, at the height of its power in the middle decades of the 20th century, possessed resources, reach, and institutional influence sufficient to threaten even the most heavily protected witnesses the state could produce, and that the death of Abe Reles, whatever its exact mechanism, served that organization's interests so precisely and so completely that it is difficult, even now, to view it as a matter of pure and simple chance. There is an old idea, repeated so often in stories about crime and justice that it has worn smooth from overuse, that says the truth always comes out in the end. Abe Reles' story is the clearest possible argument against that comfortable idea, because more than 8 decades after his body was found on the roof of the Half Moon Hotel's kitchen extension, the truth of what happened in room 623 has never come out, and every reasonable person who has looked closely at the case has had to accept, eventually, that it may never come out at all. What we are left with instead is something more complicated and, in its own way, more instructive than a tidy resolution would have been: a life and a death that together illuminate, with unusual clarity, exactly how organized crime actually worked in 20th century America, exactly what it cost to try to bring it down from the inside, and exactly how far the underworld's reach could extend even into the very institutions built to contain it. To understand Reles' legacy, it helps to separate two things that are easy to collapse into one another but that actually tell very different stories: what Reles' cooperation actually achieved, and what his death prevented from being achieved. On the first count, the record is genuinely remarkable, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than lost in the shadow of the mystery surrounding his death. Reles' testimony, delivered over roughly a year and a half of cooperation with William O'Dwyer's office, provided law enforcement with the single most detailed, most comprehensive, most internally corroborated account of organized crime's contract-killing apparatus that any American prosecutor had ever obtained from a witness who had actually operated at the center of that apparatus rather than merely observed it from its margins. Men who had spent years believing themselves protected by the code of silence, by the sheer difficulty of ever developing a witness with Reles' level of direct knowledge, found themselves convicted, in several cases sentenced to death, on the strength of an account that no external investigation, however diligent, could ever have reconstructed on its own. Murder, Incorporated, as a functioning, disciplined killing operation, was substantially and permanently dismantled as a direct result of what Reles told investigators, and the broader public understanding of how organized crime actually functioned, its discipline, its business logic, its capacity to treat murder as a managed, almost bureaucratic service rather than an act of chaotic passion, owes an enormous debt to the specific, granular detail Reles provided, testimony that shaped not just individual prosecutions but the entire subsequent framework through which American law enforcement came to understand and eventually prosecute organized crime as a structured criminal conspiracy rather than a collection of unrelated individual offenses. On the second count, what his death prevented, the record is just as clear and considerably more painful to contemplate. Albert Anastasia walked away from the single greatest legal threat he ever faced, continuing to operate at the highest levels of organized crime for another decade and a half, protected in the most literal sense by the death of the one witness capable of ending his career through legitimate legal process rather than through the underworld's own eventual, violent reckoning with him in a Manhattan barbershop chair in 1957. Every subsequent prosecutor who tried to build a case against a syndicate figure operating at Anastasia's level had to do so without the benefit of what Reles' testimony against him might have established, without the precedent his successful prosecution might have set for reaching genuinely powerful syndicate leadership rather than merely its expendable street-level operators. The broader strategic ambition that O'Dwyer's office had been building toward, using an insider's systematic cooperation to work upward through an entire criminal organization's chain of command, rather than picking off individual operatives one at a time from the outside, suffered a setback from which it took American law enforcement decades to genuinely recover, decades during which organized crime continued to operate with a level of institutional stability and impunity that a successful Anastasia prosecution might have meaningfully disrupted. And there is the human dimension of the story too, which is easy to lose beneath the historical and institutional analysis but which sat at the center of everything from the very beginning. Reles was not a good man by any reasonable measure, and nothing about the mystery surrounding his death should obscure that basic fact. He was, by his own admissions to investigators, directly responsible for or complicit in a staggering number of killings over the course of his career, a man who had built his entire adult identity around a capacity for cold, business-like violence that even hardened criminals around him found unsettling. His decision to cooperate with prosecutors was not, by any account, born out of genuine remorse or a late-arriving moral awakening about the lives he had taken or helped take. It was born out of fear, calculated and rational fear, of the specific fate that awaited him if his case proceeded to trial without the shield of cooperation, and the information he provided, however historically valuable it proved to be, was offered in service of his own survival rather than any principle of justice he had suddenly discovered. This does not make his testimony less valuable, and it does not make his death less significant. But it complicates any temptation to view him as a redemptive figure, a criminal who found his way to the side of justice in his final years. He remained, to the very end, exactly the kind of man Brownsville had made him, calculating, self-interested, willing to do whatever the moment required to preserve his own position, whether that meant orchestrating a killing on behalf of the organization or dismantling that same organization from the witness stand once his own survival demanded it. That complexity is, in its own way, exactly what makes the case endure as more than a simple morality tale. There is no clean hero in this story, no figure whose fate the audience can root for without reservation. The man who might have brought down one of the most dangerous killers in American criminal history was himself one of the most prolific killers of his own era, cooperating not out of conscience but out of self-preservation, protected not because the state had genuinely earned his trust but because his knowledge had made him too valuable to lose. The prosecutors who built their case around him were pursuing a genuinely important and genuinely dangerous fight against organized crime, and yet the very apparatus they constructed to protect their star witness ultimately failed him, whether through negligence, corruption, or some combination that will likely never be fully disentangled. And the institution that failed him, the police department, the very body charged with protecting the public from exactly the kind of violence Reles had spent his life perpetrating, carried, by this point in its history, its own long and well-documented relationship with the organized crime it was supposedly working to destroy. Nearly everyone involved in this story, on every side of it, carries some measure of compromise, some contradiction between the role they were supposed to play and the choices they actually made, and it is precisely that moral murkiness, as much as the unresolved mystery of the death itself, that has kept the story alive in the American imagination for more than 8 decades. Coney Island itself, where the Half Moon Hotel once stood, has changed almost beyond recognition since November of 1941. The hotel that housed Reles during his final weeks would eventually be demolished, its physical presence erased from the landscape decades ago, so thoroughly that visitors to the neighborhood today would find no marker, no plaque, no visible trace at all of the events that once unfolded there. Events that briefly made this particular stretch of Brooklyn's beachfront the focus of national attention and the site of one of the most consequential unsolved deaths in the history of American organized crime. There is something fitting, in a melancholy sort of way, about that erasure, a reminder that even the most sensational, most consequential events eventually recede into a landscape that moves on without them, leaving behind only the written record, the newspaper clippings, the trial transcripts, and the persistent, unanswered questions that historians and writers continue to turn over, generation after generation, without ever quite managing to close the file for good. What, then, should we make of Abe Reles, sitting here in the present, looking back across more than 8 decades at a man whose life traced such an extraordinary arc, from a tenement childhood in Brownsville, through 15 years as one of the most efficient and feared killers organized crime ever produced, into a final chapter as the most valuable and most closely guarded witness against organized crime the American justice system had ever assembled, and finally to a death that remains, in every meaningful sense, unresolved? Perhaps the honest answer is that his story resists the kind of tidy meaning we instinctively want to extract from it. It is not simply a story about crime not paying, because in the most direct and immediate sense, the man Reles' testimony helped convict did pay, while the man Reles was preparing to bring down at the moment of his death never paid at all, walking free for another decade and a half before finally meeting a violent end that had nothing to do with the justice system Reles had tried to serve. It is not simply a story about the triumph of institutional justice over organized crime, because the institution charged with protecting its star witness may well have failed him through its own compromised loyalties, in a failure that, whatever its precise mechanism, unmistakably served organized crime's interests. And it is not simply a cautionary tale about the dangers of breaking the underworld's code of silence, because Reles' cooperation, whatever its ultimate cost to him personally, produced real, lasting, historically significant consequences for the organization he had helped build and then helped destroy. What it is, perhaps most honestly, is a story about the genuine limits of institutional power when it comes into direct conflict with an organized, resourceful, and deeply entrenched criminal enterprise, a demonstration that even the full, focused attention of a determined prosecutor's office, even round-the-clock armed protection, even the successful extraction of an unprecedented body of insider testimony, could still, in the end, fall short against an adversary with enough money, enough patience, and enough reach into the surrounding institutions to find the gap in even the most carefully constructed defense. That is not a comfortable lesson, and it is not the lesson that popular stories about crime and justice usually want to teach, which is part of why the case of Abe Reles has never quite settled into the kind of clean historical narrative that gets fully absorbed into the popular imagination the way some other organized crime stories have. It remains, instead, a genuinely open wound in the historical record, a reminder that some questions, however thoroughly investigated, however many decades pass, simply never get answered, and that the people best positioned to answer them took what they knew to their own graves, whether those graves came from the electric chair at Sing Sing, from a barbershop bullet in 1957, or from a 6-story fall onto a Coney Island rooftop on a November morning in 1941. The window in room 623 is gone now, along with the rest of the Half Moon Hotel. The men who stood guard that night are gone too, and so is every single person who might have been able to say, with real certainty, exactly what happened in the hours between Reles going to bed and his body being found below. What remains is the record, the trial transcripts, the testimony, the newspaper accounts, the decades of investigation and speculation that followed, and within that record, an enduring, unresolved silence at exactly the point where certainty matters most. Perhaps that silence is, in its own way, the most fitting final chapter this particular story could have received. Abe Reles spent the last 2 years of his life breaking silence, systematically, deliberately, more thoroughly than any informant of his era had ever broken it before, unraveling the code that had governed his entire criminal life and sending men who had once called him a brother to their deaths on the strength of what he chose to say. And then, in the end, the silence closed back over him, over the exact circumstances of his own death, as completely and as permanently as it had ever closed over any of the men whose murders he had once helped orchestrate and then later helped expose. The canary sang, longer and louder than anyone in his world had ever expected him to sing. And then, one November morning, the singing simply stopped, and no one left alive has ever been able to say, with real confidence, exactly why. If this story pulled you into the shadows of Brownsville and Coney Island the way it pulled me together putting it into words, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more tales from the underworld's darkest corners, hit that like button if this one got under your skin, and drop a comment telling me which chapter hit you hardest, because there are dozens more stories like this one waiting in the shadows of history, and I'll be back soon to tell you the next one.